if that's a regular occurrence, you want to spot that in the evaluation process. And we certainly measure team turnover in our reviews. You can see and look what other customers have said, how much the team changes during the course of a project. And if it's something that you see as systemic on their reviews, it's a definite red flag.
Growing a business requires a holistic approach that extends beyond sales and marketing. This approach needs alignment among people, processes, and technologies. So if you're a business owner, operations, or finance leader looking to learn growth strategies from your peers and competitors, you're tuned into the right podcast. Welcome to the WBS Podcast, where scalable growth using business systems is our number one priority. Now, here is your host, Sam Gupta.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the WBS Podcast. I'm Sam Gupta, your host and principal consultant at digital transformation consulting firm Elevate IQ. If you're embarking on the journey of your digital transformation, you will have several options. You can either work directly with the software provider and utilize their implementation team, or work through a consulting company. Both approaches have their pros and cons, and the process requires due diligence from your side to ensure that the company you are hiring truly understands your business and is qualified to implement your project. In today's episode, we have our guest, Bonnie Tinder, who discusses the pros and cons of various digital transformation project models, working directly with software providers or through a consulting firm. She also discusses how these projects vary in the enterprise versus SMB space and how team turnover is the most significant contributor to project failures. Finally, she discusses the most important criteria for selecting a software vendor. Let me introduce Bonnie to you. For over 25 years, Bonnie Tinder has worked with top software companies leading implementation, marketing, and sales initiatives. In 2018, she founded Raven Intel, a peer review site for enterprise software consulting designed to help customers make a well-informed choice in an implementation partner. In addition, Raven Intel works with leading system integrators and software vendors to understand and interpret the voice of the customer related to implementation and project success from an independent perspective. In building the Raven Intel community, Bonnie has interviewed over 1,000 customers about their enterprise software implementation experiences and has produced several reports on the state of HCM implementation and software. With that, let's get to the conversation. Hey, welcome to the show, Bonnie.
Thank you so much for having me, Sam. I'm excited about our conversation today.
And I am super excited to talk to you as well, because the number of customers that you typically talk to, the kind of stories you are going to have in this conversation, I am super excited. To kick things off, do you want to start with your personal story and your current focus, Bonnie?
Of course, yes. Well, I am the founder and CEO of Raven Intel. And Raven Intel is a peer review company, much like Yelp or Glassdoor. But the reviews that we collect are all about enterprise software implementation and the consulting companies that complete that project work. You know, at our core, we're all about helping customers make a great choice in a consulting partner and really know all of their options. And a little bit about me and my story is that I founded this company about 3 years ago after being in the HR tech space for the last 25 years. And what I saw as just a really painful sort of point in time or moment that HR professionals and enterprise software professionals or people who, work with enterprise software within a business, whether it's finance or accounting or supply chain management, is this idea of implementation being just a real thorn in the side of anyone looking to change a software. And so I wanted to help improve that process and make it easy for customers to really know who were the best consulting firms doing the best work with customers around implementation and projects, and really make that decision process a lot less risky for for professionals. And, as I mentioned before, I started in the HCM space because that was my background. But, my company focuses on all enterprise software, all ERP, and the consulting firms that are responsible for project work around that.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting the way you use word less right before risky in case of your digital transformation engagements. And the reason why I find it so interesting is because they are always going to be painful. They are always going to be risky. So what we can do is we can minimize the risk. We can study the data a lot more to figure out, okay, what can we do to make sure that the experience is going to be less painful. It's not going to be as alarming as typically how it is perceived in the enterprise software and implementation community. So we are going to dig far deeper into that. What are the best practices? But before we do that, we have one of these standard questions that we ask every single guest that come on the show. And that is going to be your perspective on business growth, Ani.
Absolutely. So I think innovation fuels growth. I think changing the status quo and sort of disrupting the way that things have always been done is, first of all, it's what I'm passionate about, is creative ways of doing things, new ways of looking at things. And I think that, the key to success and growth is to change what's not working and improve it.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree there. Just thinking about the improving and figuring out, how we can improve is definitely a right mindset to have. So now let's go back to your experience about working with different OEMs and the consulting firms, right? So when we look at these enterprise software implementations, typically any of the manufacturing companies or the distribution companies, if they are looking for their either the ERP implementations or the digital transformation engagements, they are going to have two choices. They can either work directly with the OEMs, and OEM in this particular case is going to be the software manufacturer, the vendors that are providing the software. Sometimes they have their own consulting services. Sometimes they can hire one of the value-added resellers or, a system integrator. So there are multiple choices. So from your experience, when you work with these customers, what are some of the pros and cons, Vani, that you have seen in your experience working directly with the software manufacturer or working with one of the consulting companies?
Well, I think it really depends on a customer's individual situation to really determine which route is best. And so, as you mentioned, you can have your software vendor or, the OEM, as you mentioned, implement that software for you. And I think the pros in that sort of scenario is they know that system as good as anyone, and there's no one else that they can blame if the project goes sideways. So it's truly one throat to choke, right? There's no finger pointing that, oh, hey, well, it was the consulting firm who did this or et cetera. On the other hand, though, I would say the biggest con to working with the OEM or the software vendor is that they don't have as broad the industry knowledge and perspective and really the functional expertise that a consulting firm can bring that's a lot wider than just the software itself. The other thing is software vendors' availability of resources is a problem as well. And whereas third-party implementers or the consulting firms, you have a lot more choice versus your software vendor. You're kind of stuck with the team they assign you, and so I would say that also is a potential negative there. I would say if you look to a third-party consulting firm, we refer to them as SIs or systems integrators.
Yeah.
A lot of times, I think that the big pro that you have there is that they have a broader set of sort of industry knowledge. What are the best practices of customers beyond just the customers who use that software? And I think they have a broader transformational expertise as well. So they can look at processes and help you rethink those, where I don't think the software vendor is as attuned to those sort of situations. What I will tell you is that my company, Raven Intel, we look at both types of scenarios. The projects implemented by software vendors versus the projects implemented by the third parties. And no matter what system we're talking about or what software, the customers in general are more satisfied with projects when using an outside third party versus those implemented by a software vendor themselves. So overall, that's what we see on these reviews is, customers more satisfied with the third party implementers or SIs.
So interesting perspective there. And I would like to dig a little deeper into that. Do you have any more data points why these customers are satisfied when they are working with the third party consulting firms? Is that primarily because they have far deeper industry knowledge, as you pointed out, as the pro for these third party consulting firms, or are they just going out of their way to satisfy the needs? What exactly is going on? Do you have any more data points there in terms of why customers feel far more satisfied working with the consulting firm as opposed to working with OEMs?
I think it's a little bit of both. The fact that the third party or the SIs have more that they can bring to the table beyond just implementation software setup. So from a knowledge perspective, I think there's some greater, broader levels of expertise there than a software implementer or software vendor's implementation team. So that certainly, we see that. The other thing is just in terms of the overall approach to project satisfaction, the SIs want to make a partner for life. So they want an implementation to go well because that will ensure that they have then additional work that they can bring in throughout the lifetime of the software, that customer uses the software, or even beyond that, because they can bring consulting expertise beyond the software as well. So they look at implementation as almost a land and expand sort of scenario, so that they are very interested in a satisfied customer so that they can have that customer then as a potential revenue generator throughout many years. Versus an implementation team at a software vendor, they're looking to maintain a contract and sell more software licenses, but services aren't necessarily where software vendors' focus is. So their approach to satisfaction is let's get to the end of job here and let's make sure that we keep this customer happy, but they're not looking to sort of expand on the services area in the same way that an SI would be.
Yeah, you actually hit on a couple of very important points there. In fact, Amisi, I have seen this in my personal experience because I have actually been on the both side of the house. So when I actually was in a corporation where I was sort of responsible for selling the licenses, at that time, there's always this competition inside for the resources. So if you look at any of the organization that is in the business of selling the licenses, there's going to be a product organization, and typically the product organization is going to be responsible for improvising the product, and there is a separate organization that is going to be responsible for implementation or the services. Now, when we look at the organizational structure of this corporation, typically the people who are really involved in the implementation side of the things, they never get the same recognition as the people who are going to be on the product side of things. So typically you are not going to get the same talent that you would probably need in case of your implementation. But when we look at, let's say, the consulting companies or the service companies, their bread and butter is really going to be the consulting or services. That's what they are doing day in, day out. So their talent strategy is going to be aligned with the, providing the best service possible for the customers. So that is one more issue that I have personally seen between your OEM and the SIs. And the other issue that I would like to bring to your attention is going to be in any given implementation, at least from my experience, what I've seen is there's not going to be just one product that is going to be involved in the implementation. There are going to be at least 5 to 6 and sometimes 15 to 20 different products. And when we are talking to these ERP vendors or the CRM vendors, it doesn't matter which tool that is, but for their expertise is going to be limited to that specific tool, and the only language that they can speak is going to be related to that product. And if there is going to be any issue that is going to be beyond that product or the tool that you might be using, it's going to be a lot of blame game there. You might have multiple vendors involved regardless, right? So you are not going to have the same kind of experience. So do you see similar issues there based on these two things that I have described, Bonnie, in your data and the implementations that you are seeing?
Very much so. Very much so. And if you just look at things from a sheer cost perspective too,
Yeah.
an SI, those are billable resources that they're going to put on a project. And so they are recruiting, hopefully the top talent out there that somebody is going to say, hey, they have the expertise with this particular product, but also, have a sort of a more round skill set versus a software vendor who typically, if they're doing the implementation for you, is going to be at a lower cost because it's a fixed bid implementation in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of just the overall talent that they're going to put on the project team, it's probably going to be higher from the SI perspective. Not in all cases, and you certainly want to, if you're evaluating both routes, for your project, you want to be introduced to the actual project resources that are going to get assigned to your account, whether it's on the software vendor side or on the SI side. And you're going to want to make sure that you actually meet the people who will be assigned to your project during your evaluation, not afterwards. And that's a lot of customers feel, don't get their project resources assigned until after they've signed a contract. And it's a risky situation because if you've never met the people who will be involved, you really don't know what you're buying.
Yeah, interesting perspective there. So let's take a scenario here of some of the vendors, especially in the small to medium sized businesses. So let's say if we look at the enterprise space, the majority of the implementations are probably going to be done by the third parties or the SIs. I don't know if any of the major vendors actually do the implementations in the enterprise space. But when you look at the SMB space, in case of SMB, there are a lot of companies, they don't even have resellers. So all of their implementations are going to be managed by them. So let's say if I'm the manufacturing executive or a CFO, and I am actually looking for my next digital transformation initiative, or I'm evaluating, let's say, my ERP system, and I have a bunch of choices. In one case, it's going to be a vendor who, let's say, they do their services, they also sell their licenses. Now, I don't really have the multiple parties that I need to choose. So would you see this as a red flag for this specific vendor? Let's say if they don't have any reseller. Sometimes when we look at the competitive pitches, some vendors are going to say that, I don't really sell myself. I am only going to be selling through my local resellers, and that's probably a plus. So the argument is all over the place, to be honest, okay? And sometimes I get confused, okay? What is better? Whether the going through reseller is better, going through OEM that may not have any sort of resellers out there in the market, is that going to be better? Should we be completely isolating them from the selection process? So how would you approach that? Let's say if you have multiple different products and they each have their own way of distributing the product, they all have their own way of serving the customers. So would you look this as a negative flag, red flag, when, let's say, if the vendor is doing everything by themselves versus utilizing a consulting company?
Not necessarily. I don't think it is a red flag if the software vendor implements their own software. There's many, many successful implementations by companies that implement the software that they sell. And that's typically a software vendor does their own implementation unless they're one of the big ERPs. In a way, software vendors that want to scale and grow very quickly and are dealing with larger type of customers, they have a partner ecosystem that they want to grow out because they can handle more implementations that way and they can get a global reach. And there's all sorts of reasons that these larger ERP vendors go with a partner ecosystem as sort of their distribution point. But that's not the case with a lot of business software that's designed, B2B software that's designed for a small business environment, manufacturing, et cetera. So it's not necessarily a red flag. I think though what you want to do during the evaluation process is the same whether you choose a third party or your software vendor is doing the implementation, is you want to get to know the team. You want to make sure that during the evaluation, they understand what your needs are and that they've scoped out the project effectively, and that you feel confident that they're listening to you and have a understanding about what you want the finished product to look like. The other thing that you want to make sure is that in the statement of work or the contract that you sign, that you have a very specific layout of the project plan that will tell you what are the deliverables, when will this be completed by, what's the cost, and what are the things that you're going to do versus my team having to do. And one of the things that we hear in the project reviews at Raven is the customer was sort of surprised by how much they had to do during the implementation and be prepared for, versus thinking, oh, well, it's this consulting firm is going to do that. Certainly there's some that do, but if you don't have a real handle on what is it that I'm going to be expected to do as the customer, that you want to go in with your eyes wide open in terms of what's the commitment on your part versus the software vendor or the implementer on that account. So I think the important takeaway and everything I just said there is that statement of work really needs to, in black and white terms, spell out and demonstrate that your vendor or your SI understands what you want the final product to look like at go live.
Yeah, some interesting insights there. And I am actually going to bring some more points related to the team aspect that you mentioned. And one more thing that I personally like to look at is going to be overall corporate strategy, right? And I think we touched about that a bit in our previous conversation. So here, number one, when we look at the customers that have actually worked with these OEMs or the consulting teams that belong to these OEMs, they typically face a lot more churn. And at least in my experience, I don't know if any of the software vendors in the market are willing to put the names of the people that are going to be involved in the project. Typically, their contracts are going to be fairly vanilla. Again, going back to my personal experience, that is going to have some sort of project plan. It's probably going to have some sort of a schedule, but it's not going to have the people identified in the contract. I don't know if you have seen anything different. The other point that I would like to mention is going to be more from the corporate strategy perspective. And everything is driven by who's investing in your company. It's going to be your corporate strategy as well. So if you look at any of the software vendors, they are incentivized to sell more software licenses. If they are going to have either investors or Wall Street, doesn't matter who's funding them, but they are only interested in the software licenses. Typically, they are not measured by how much services you have sold, because that's not their business model. If you look at their business model. So since they are incentivized to sell a lot more software licenses, they are not going to have overall as much attention on the service component. At least that's my experience. So two things. Number one, from the team perspective, in my experience, I personally see a lot more churn. And number two is going to be commitment to the service component. Do you see similar things in your experience, or your experience is different?
Well, you mentioned churn, and that's certainly a real thorny aspect of a project, is when you have team turnover. In our projects that we see in general, we have over 1,000 reviews of enterprise software projects completed within the last 2 years. 60% of the time, the team did not change. So 60% of the time, the team stayed intact. 40% of the time, though, that's close to half, the team changed, with 10% saying that there was lots of change. So not only did a project manager change once, but they changed multiple times. And that idea of knowledge transfer, if I see a review that comes in that's had a lot of team change, I can almost guarantee the overall satisfaction with that project is going to be negative, as well as the time aspect. So was the project completed on time? in a lot of cases, those projects are late as a result of team change. And so this idea of churn is a reality, especially now in 2021 with the job market, I think, heating up and a lot of people hiring. There is turnover, voluntary turnover happening on some of these consulting firms. And the best project resources are moving to different companies because they're in high demand. They always are. And so I think it really behooves you to understand what's the typical turnover rate of my services partner who's going to be assigned my account. How many, what do they expect the team turnover to look like? What it has been in the past. And that's one of the things that we measure in the reviews at Raven, because it's, you want to make sure as much as possible that your team stays intact, because that's I think the biggest contributor to success is that you have the same team working on the project from start to finish. And if you can, break your project up in smaller bite-sized chunks so that you can move to a big milestone. And then if there needs to be a change at that point, change out the team. But keeping a small, that team intact is a big contributor to success.
Yeah, so interesting data and insight there. And when you are saying 40% of the time the team is being changed, and as a project manager, if I'm in any of the projects where the team is going to change, obviously that is definitely going to go out of budget. There's no question. I mean, there's no way for me as a project manager to be able to control the costs, because as you know, all of these projects are going to be extremely complex. They require significant knowledge transfer, and the new person that is actually going to come to the project, obviously they are going to require a lot more hand holding. So that is definitely not going to be a pretty situation overall when you have roughly the team changing 50% of the time. So the question I'm going to ask you is, sometimes I have personally seen that these team changes are going to be driven by the natural causes, where, let's say, if the resource has some sort of emergencies, okay, I understand that. But sometimes that could be customer triggered as well, maybe personality conflicts, and sometimes the customers don't really understand the implications of changing the team just because you are not aligned with the personality. But if you ask for the change, that's going to be a significant impact overall in terms of the budget. And I don't know how much partners communicate in terms of the risk that that you are going to have when you have this change, right? But sometimes that could be partner driven as well. So do you have any insight in terms of what is triggering these changes? Are they completely partner driven? Are they due to the natural causes? Could be emergency, could be sickness, could be family, or are these really the personality issues or real resource limitations that either partner may be having or the customer may be having?
I think there's always going to be the natural turnover. So, and that's due to family situation or somebody just natural turnover on voluntarily leaving the company. So there's a percentage of that time that happens. And I think that, SIs and software vendors sort of account for a certain that situation happening, and they try and keep that percentage down. What you mentioned, the personality conflicts, and hey, I don't like my project manager and want to switch them out. That happens some of the time as well, and any team change, if there's something like that really you have a strong sense that this is not the right person. If you need to make a change like that, you want to make sure you're doing it as early in the process as possible. So you want to find, you sort of need to go with your gut at the beginning of a project. If you sense somebody's not the right fit, do it earlier than later, because the later that you have to change out a project resource, the harder that's going to be. So if you're going to make that call, do it soon. If it gets to the end of the project and, sometimes the devil, is better than the devil that you don't, in those situations. So that's the second point. I think the third point is sort of something that happens in the world of consulting and project management. And that is, there are new projects that come up that all of a sudden you want to put your top resources on. And it's in those situations that customers really get grumpy because they were assigned the A team, let's say for the first phase of their project, and lo and behold, the software vendor or the SI won a big new contract and they need to put their best people on it. Well, they want to take your resource off and assign then you with the B team or an alternate team. It's in those situations that sort of a trick of the trade, and consulting firms have to do that in some cases. But if that's a regular occurrence, you want to spot that in the evaluation process. And we certainly measure team turnover in our reviews. You can see and look at what other customers have said, how much the team changes during the course of a project. And if it's something that you see as systemic on their reviews, it's a definite red flag.
Yeah, could not agree more. With respect to firing the people early, I guess, that goes to your hiring processes as well. The sooner you make that decision, the lower the cost is going to be overall, the lower the impact is going to be. So now we are going to move this conversation to the other things that we wanted to discuss. And there were a couple of things related to the overuse of the references that I personally see in the community. So two things. Number one, a lot of software vendors, what they are going to say is, you know what, I have done this 5,000 times, 10,000 times. And these numbers are very catchy because as a customer, if I listen to those, then I'm going to think, you know what, if this has been implemented 10,000 times, what are the odds that it is actually going to fail in my implementation? Right. And in my experience, no two ERP implementations are same. No two businesses are same. And that's why no two ERP implementations are same. And if a tool has been successful 10,000 times for a specific business, there is a high chance that it could very well fail in the next business, right? So there is this overemphasis, I would say, in these numbers, the number of installations, that is number one. And number two, providing these happy references. We all know how references work in case of hiring. And let's say if I'm going to talk to 2 happy customers, that does not tell me the whole story because I may have 80 failures and 2 happy implementations. And the only thing I'm providing is 2 happy references. So does that really provide any sort of insight there? In my opinion, not. So what is your experience there when these vendors use, let's say, the number of implementations or the references as a shield as opposed to providing the real intel, the real insight about how the solution is going to work, whether the solution is the right fit for the customer's business or not, and how the implementation is going to work?
I think it's good to talk to references, and I think it's good to have a comfort level that your potential partner has done this type of implementation work before. So those numbers are, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Those are 2 good things. However, those are 2 points in your decision process. You also need to really see that they have demonstrated they can listen to your needs and recite them back to you so that they have defined a project plan that is custom and tailored for your situation. This idea of a vanilla project plan really would demonstrate the fact that they haven't taken the time to do a proper discovery with you. If they're going to rush you through that step, that would be what I would say is a big red flag. I think the voice of the customer, of their previous customers, is really important. Certainly, I started an entire company based on this idea that you can check references easily through, independent reviews and things like that. And so, a company like Raven Intel has project reviews that we've vetted that we know aren't the 2 references that they use for every sales call. So I think that's an important thing is to get wider and to do your own reference checking to uncover your vendor, your SI. It's never going to give you an unhappy customer. And so, trying to sort of get under the covers there and get at the authentic voice of the customer. Ask if you can get in contact with another customer. Don't just sort of check the box in terms of that conversation. Ask the hard questions. What were your challenges? How did this vendor SI solve them? What did you wish you knew before you started this project that you know now? I mean, asking those questions, not the thumbs up, thumbs down type of stuff, will really help you get at, was this a good partner or not? And if you can find an unsolicited reference, that's even better. Somebody that your vendor didn't give to you, because as I mentioned before, they're not going to give you a happy reference every time. They're not going to give you an unhappy reference to talk to.
Yeah, completely agree there. If you can figure out the unsolicited, the customer reference, obviously that is very valuable. And that's a real test right there. So now let's talk about the criteria. So let's say if I were to develop a criteria, and you touched on some important points there that go deeper into your questions when you are evaluating these vendors. And let's say if I'm the executive, I'm the manufacturing executive, and I have never done any sort of digital implementations in the past. For me, it's going to be probably very hard to evaluate two different solutions or two different vendors, even though I may be asking, let's say, the hard questions. And obviously these guys are going to be very good, right? I mean, sometimes they are going to do the brush off, and sometimes they are going to be providing the deeper explanation. But for me, if I have never done an implementation in the past, it may still be harder to evaluate. So in your opinion, how would you build this criteria in selecting a partner? What will be, let's say, top 3 or 4 or 5 factors that you would look for when you are hiring a partner?
Well, we actually came up with a short guide. So the 10 questions that you should be asking a potential consulting partner, which you can find at ravenintel.com, that really highlights, I think, the 10 major questions that you need to consider. If I had to pick, though, the top 3, number 1, it would be your potential partner should have previous experience. And by previous experience, they should be able to point to specific projects of the software, modules, and geographic scope that are similar to your project. Similar industry expertise is important too. So if you're in manufacturing, you want to find somebody who works with manufacturers and knows that industry as well. We talked to, one customer who said the consulting firm that they chose did a great job in North America, but the wheels came off the bus during the European rollout. So you want to make sure that the experience that they're touting looks like your project. I think the second major thing that you want to uncover is who is my team going to be and where is my team located? Because as we've talked earlier, it's all about the people. And you want to make sure you have a comfort level that you know that the people who will be assigned to your account are a cultural fit with your team as much as you possibly can. And not all cases can you write names into the contract, but if your project's big enough and you're paying enough money for an implementation, that absolutely should be enough money for the services. That absolutely should be something that you should be able to put into the contract itself is here are the resources who potentially could be assigned to my project. And again, the things that we see there, customers getting really frustrated when during the sales process, they are introduced to the A team, but then when it comes time to do their project, all of a sudden the JV team comes in, and they have kids 1 or 2 years out of school trying to handle their account. So that's another thing is who are the people? And I think the third most important thing that you need to have a comfort level with is how has this firm scoped my project? Do they truly understand our needs? Have they taken time to do this discovery? And if they cannot demonstrate in a statement of work very clearly what the time, the cost, and what the outcomes are going to look like and who's responsible for what, then you're not going to get to the end of the project and that be clear. So you want to make sure that you understand the statement of work. You read it, you get all your people on the project team to read it as well, because if you have a flimsy statement of work, there's going to be a lot of change orders that you're going to realize in the long run. So those would be my top 3. Again, there's 10 major questions that I would say that you need to ask, and that's certainly out on our website. You can go and take a look at that if you're interested.
Okay, amazing insights there. So that's it for today, Bonnie. Do you have any last minute closing thoughts?
I think the thought that I would leave with today is that the success long term of your digital transformation is going to be determined on how effective you are at the early implementation of your project and sort of getting things off the ground. And you need to spend the time and do your due diligence up front so that you're setting yourself up for success in the long term. So you want to make sure that you have a very good and clear picture about who's going to help you with the project, whether that's your software vendor or whether that's a third party, who your team is going to be, and what that blueprint looks like. Spending the time to do all of those things up front is going to pay big dividends in the future and really ensure that you're able to get your maximum benefit out of the digital transformation that you're about to embark on.
Yeah, and my personal takeaway from this conversation is going to be, irrespective of whether how good your tool is going to be or the software that you are selecting, but the major driver for the success is always going to be the culture as well as the partner that you are selecting. But you need to spend a lot of your time as well in researching and reading the reviews. And there's just so much information available over the internet nowadays. Just do your research before you engage with anybody. On that note, Bunny, I really want to thank you for your time. This has been a fun and insightful conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, and I've really enjoyed the discussion today.
I cannot thank our guests enough for coming on the show, for sharing their knowledge and journey. I always pick up learnings from our guests, and hopefully you learned something new today. If you want to learn more about Bonnie, head over to ravenintel.com. It's RAVENINTEL.com. The voice of the customer speaks volumes, and the previous experience of your peers can help you choose the best consulting firm for your future projects. Links and more information will also be available in the show notes. If anything in this podcast resonated with you and your business, you might want to check other related episodes, including the interview with Brian Sommer, who discusses why legacy ERP systems and artificial accounting practices need to change with time. Also, the interview with Bob Evans, who discusses what SMB customers need to know about cloud infrastructure providers. Also, don't forget to subscribe and spread the word among folks with similar backgrounds. If you have any questions or comments about the show, please review and rate us on your favorite podcasting platform or DM me on any social channels. I'll try my best to respond personally and make sure you get help. Thank you, and I hope to catch you on the next episode of the WBS Podcast.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the WBS Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform so you never miss an episode. For more information on growth strategies for SMBs using ERP and digital transformation, check out our community at WBS.rocks. We'll see you next time.